Okay, before we move on from Recoil, there are a few more things that I want to show you that are important to know before using it. The first thing I want to show you is how Recoil allows our components to share state. So before we do that, let's start by deleting some of our unneeded imports here, just to clean up a little bit. First of all, let's imagine that our application has 2 counter buttons instead of 1. Well, with Recoil, these will automatically share their state. So let's take a look at this in our browser. And we can see that if we click on this, it will automatically increment both. And if we change the increment by, since that's using Recoil as well, that will automatically make the exact same change to both as well. Now, this may or may not be what you want, which is why it's important to know that this is a basic feature of Recoil. If we were using the useState hook like we saw before, this wouldn't happen. Now, this can be very useful sometimes if you want to have different components that share the same state, for example. What that might look like is, let's say we had another component called something like display count. And all this did was simply display the value of the button count. All right, so this is going to be a very simple component. We're just going to say import use recoil state from recoil. And we'll say export const display count. And then we're going to do the same thing that we did before. We're going to say const number of clicks and set number of clicks equals use recoil state. And for that, we need to import the counter state. So we'll say import counter state from counter state and pass that as an argument to use recoil state. All right, and then we just have to say return, and we'll return something very simple. We'll just have a h2 heading that displays the number of clicks. We'll say number of clicks, number of clicks. And let's actually display this component in our app component. So we're going to import it into here. I'm going to say import display count from display count and display it. We'll just display it somewhere else on our page, right? We'll put it up at the top here maybe. And if we go back and take a look now, we'll see that as the number of clicks changes in our counter button component, those changes are also mirrored up here at the top in our display count component. Now, another thing to keep in mind with our display count component is that we're not actually using this state to modify the value, right? We're only concerned with knowing what the value of that state is at a given point in time. Now, in cases like this, Recoil actually provides us with a different hook called useRecoilValue that only gives us the value of the state and doesn't allow components using that hook to modify the state. So we're going to change this now to useRecoilValue, and we'll remove this set number of clicks as well as these square brackets. And that will simply give us the value of the recoil state. So let's check this, and we see that those two are mirroring each other. So that's the first other thing that I wanted to cover with Recoil. The other thing, I mentioned earlier that Recoil has 2 main concepts, and that those are atoms and selectors. And so far we've only used atoms. So what selectors do in Recoil is they take the fundamental values that are expressed as atoms and they transform them in some way or combine them into another value. So in order to demonstrate this, let's say that instead of our counter state simply storing an integer, let's say that it stored the timestamps of when each of the clicks in our application occurred. Right? So what that would look like, our default would just be an empty array. And what this array is going to contain is objects that contain both a timestamp, something like that, and they're also going to contain the amount that the counter was incremented by. All right, so they'll just be objects with those 2 values. Here's what this is going to look like. we're going to go into our counter button component. And instead of saying number of clicks and set number of clicks, we're going to change the name of this to click data and set clicks data. And increment by and set increment by can stay just as we want them to. So what we're going to be doing now is when the user clicks on our button, we're going to call this set clicks data function in order to add a new timestamp to it. So here's what that's going to look like. We're going to say set clicks data, and we're going to use a spread operator here to get all of the current clicks data and append a new click data onto the end. So what we're going to do is say timestamp, and for that we'll just say date.now. And for the amount, we're going to pass the increment by state. All right. The next question now is how do we actually calculate the number of clicks inside our counter button component? Well, one way we can do this is by simply saying clicks data.length. And let's see if that works now. We're going to refresh this. Oops, it looks like we need to change this display count component before it'll work. We're going to say, I'm going to change this to clicks data. And change this to clicks data.length. The repetitiveness here of having to say clicks data.length gives you a clue into what selectors actually do. So now if we go back here, we're going to see that it works just like before, except that this length property doesn't actually work because when we say increment by 5, all we're doing is just adding one more click data to our clicks array. So here's what we have to do in order to actually calculate that, right? We could, if we wanted to, actually use reduce in each of these places to get the sum of the amounts in all of the clicks. However, that would mean, again, duplicating that data in multiple components. So what selectors allow us to do is define that logic in a single spot. So here's what that's going to look like. We're going to create a new file, and we'll call this number of clicks selector.js. And then what we're going to do is say import selector from Recoil and create a new selector by saying export const number of clicks selector equals, and we're going to call the selector function just like we called Atom, and it's going to take a slightly different configuration object than what we saw with Atom. It is going to have a key, right? So the key will usually just be whatever name we gave to the selector, so we'll just say number of clicks selector. But then we have a function called get. Now what this function allows us to do is actually calculate a value based on existing values in atoms. So here's what it's going to look like. First of all, this takes an object with a get property that we can use to get the values of other atoms and selectors. And then we're going to have to import the counter state atom by saying import counter state from counter state. And what we can do now is get the current clicks data from that counter state by saying const clicks data equals get counter state. All right, so that's what we use that get function for. Once we have the clicks data now, we just need to sum up the amounts of all of the click objects. So what we're going to do is say const total clicks equals clicks data dot reduce, and don't worry too much about the technical details here if you don't work with reduce very often. All we're going to use it for here is just to find the sum of all of the amounts. We're going to say sum and click, and we're going to say return sum plus click dot amount. And then all we have to do is return this total clicks variable. We're just going to say return total clicks. And what we can do now is inside our counter button, instead of using our counter state and saying clicks data.length, we can use that selector we defined. So instead of counter state, we're going to say import number of clicks selector from number of clicks selector, and pass that to use recoil state. We're going to say number of clicks selector. Okay, and then we need to change the length. And we also have to remove this set clicks data. In fact, what we're going to want to do instead is actually use recoil value, since we normally don't want to actually set the value of a selector. So we're going to say clicks data, and we're going to import use recoil value. All right, so we'll say use recoil value. But then we also do need the use recoil state for our clicks data. So what we're going to do is say const, and we're not actually going to need the value of that. And we'll say set clicks data equals use recoil state, and pass our, oops, I didn't mean to remove it. Let's just say counter state, and pass counter state to our use recoil state. And that should be all we need to do. So let's take a look at our application now and click on it. And because of how we're calling set clicks data, we actually do need clicks data from up here. And come to think of it, a better name for this one up here would just be number of clicks. Okay, which we'll change this one to as well. We'll say number of clicks times. And before we take a look at it, we need to change our display count as well. In fact, let's just remove it since we don't need it anymore. We're just going to take display count out. And now if we click on our button, we should see that it works like we wanted it to before. So that's how selectors work in Recoil, and as you can imagine, they can be a very useful tool in making our application state management more robust. Okay, the next state management tool that we're going to take a look at here is Redux, which is probably one of the most popular state management tools, with the obvious exception of use state and context, which are included in the React library. Now, first of all, in order to prevent things from getting too complicated with all the changes we made with Recoil, what I've done is I've reverted the code back to the point that we were at when we first added the counter button with the use state hook. You can find this in the starting state of the exercise files, so you don't need to worry about actually doing this by hand. So before we move on, I do want to point out that what we're going to be covering in this video is just the very basics of how Redux works and how to implement a counter button using Redux. So to begin with, let's install the Redux packages. There are two of them. The first one is going to be called Redux, and the second one is going to be called React Redux, which contains the React bindings for the Redux library. All right, so now that we have that installed, let's just run our application so that we can look at it as we make changes. So Redux state management has several key parts, and we're going to create a new file for each of those different parts. The first part of a Redux application are called actions. Now, actions are basically anything that can happen in our application. When a user clicks on a button, when data finishes loading, when data starts loading, any action that could potentially change the state of our entire application is considered an action. So we're going to create actions.js here. We'll come back to that in just a minute. The next part of a Redux application is something called reducers. Basically, reducers tell Redux how the state of our application should change whenever a given action occurs. Again, we'll see what that looks like in just a minute. And the other part of a Redux application is something called selectors, which are pretty similar to the selectors that we saw in Recoil. They take care of allowing our components to accurately get data out of the state, as well as occasionally doing things like transforming it. Okay, so let's go back to our actions. Actions in Redux are basically just JSON objects that contain the type of the action as well as the payload. So here's what they'll generally look like. Let's create an action for when our counter button is clicked. We're going to say export const counter button clicked. And actions, as I said, are JSON objects with a type property, which is just the name of the action. We usually put this in capital snake case, so we'll say something like counter button clicked. and the payload, which contains extra data about the action. So in our case, it might contain an amount property that says how much we should actually increment the counter by. So that's what actions look like. Let's move on to reducers. Reducers, as I said before, tell Redux how the state of our application should change when a given action occurs. Now, reducers almost always take the form of functions. So here's what our reducer is going to look like. We're going to say export const, and we're going to give our reducer the name number of clicks reducer. And our reducer functions usually take two arguments. The first argument is the current state. So that would be the current number of clicks in our application. And we're usually going to want to give that a default value in case this is the first time the reducer is called. The second argument is the action that occurred. So essentially all of the reducers in our Redux application will be called when any action occurs. So here's how we tell Redux how to change the state when a given action occurs. Basically, what we have to do is return the new state that Redux will care about. So if we just wanted to say return state in here, then that would mean that no matter what action occurred in our application, the state wouldn't change, since whenever an action occurs, we're just returning that same state over again. What we'll generally do is we'll want to get the type of the action that just occurred. So we'll say something like const type equals action. And then we'll want to use a switch case statement on that type. So we're going to say switch type. And then we'll have cases based on that type. So what we're going to want to do is come up with a list of the different actions that this reducer actually cares about, right? In other words, what actions will actually cause our number of clicks to change? In our case, there's only one action to choose from, and that is in fact going to change the number of clicks. We're going to add this counter button clicked string as a case here. And if that happens, what we're going to do is we're going to say return state plus action.payload.amount. And that'll basically add the amount of that action to the state. And of course, we usually need to have a default case here, which will simply return the state, since as I said earlier, every reducer in our application is going to be called whenever any action is triggered. So that's what our reducer looks like. It's pretty simple for now. Obviously, these can get a lot more complex as your applications get more complex. So let's move on now to our selectors. Selectors, basically all these do is they tell our components where in the state to find a given value that they're looking for. So we're just going to have one selector here for now, and that's going to be the number of clicks selector, which we'll call get number of clicks. All right. And what this does is it takes the entire Redux store as an argument, right? So the entire state of our application is an argument, and again, tells our components where to find that. So what we're going to do here is say state.number of clicks. I'll show you how the number of clicks gets there in the state in just a second. So at this point, we have our actions, we have our reducers, and we have our selectors. So the next thing we're going to do is create our Redux store. So here's what that's going to look like. We're going to create a new file here called store.js. And we're going to import a few things up here at the top. The first thing we're going to do is import something called create store from Redux. And we're also going to import something called combine reducers. All right. Next up, we're going to import our reducers by saying import all as reducers from our reducers file. All right, so this imports all of the exports from that file as an object. And next up, we're going to create what's called our root reducer. This is basically where we define how each of our individual reducers fits into the overall state of our application. So here's what it's going to look like in our case. We're going to say const root reducer equals combine reducers. And then we pass an object to this reducer that basically maps the names of our data in the Redux store to the reducers that we defined in our reducers file. In fact, just to make this a little more clear, instead of importing all the reducers, let's specifically import our number of clicks reducer. Then we're going to pass an object to combine reducers, where we'll say number of clicks. So that's the key in the state that the value of our number of clicks will be stored at. And then we tell Redux that we want the number of clicks reducer to be the reducer that will manage that part of the state. All right, now that we have our root reducer, the only thing we have left to do is say export const store equals create store and pass our root reducer to it as an argument. And that's how we create our Redux store. So now that we have the store, which is going to contain and manage all of the data for our application, what we're going to do is open up our app file and add the Redux provider to our application. This is very similar to what we did before with both context and recoil. So here's what that's going to look like. We're going to say import provider from React Redux. And then down here, we're going to wrap basically our entire application, which isn't very big right now, granted, in this provider. So our entire application will have access to the Redux store's state. And then the only other thing we have to do is import the store that we created in our store file. We're going to say import store from store and pass that as a prop to this provider. So we'll say store equals store. Okay, and that's all we have to do now. So let's add our counter button back to our app component here. We'll say counter button. We're going to have to import it up here as well. We'll say import counter button from counter button. So how do we actually access the values now inside our Redux store as well as dispatch actions from our components? Well, we do those using two special hooks provided by Redux, and those hooks are called useSelector and useDispatch. Let me show you how both of these work. We're going to say import from React Redux. And then instead of having this number of clicks use the useState hook, we're going to say const number of clicks equals useSelector. And then this useSelector hook expects a selector, that is a function that takes the state and maps it to a value as an argument. And as it happens, we created our selector earlier, so we just need to import this getNumberOfClicks selector and add it to our counterbutton component. So let's import it. We're going to say import getNumberOfClicks from selectors and pass that as an argument to our useSelector hook. So getNumberOfClicks. So that's how we get the number of clicks from our store. The question now is, how do we actually dispatch this action, right? This counter button clicked action that we created in order to increment the state? Well, the way that we do that is by importing that action. We're going to say import counter button clicked from actions. And then we need to use this useDispatch hook to basically get access to a function that will allow us to trigger this action in a way that Redux will know about it. That might sound a little confusing, so let me just show you what it looks like. We're going to say const dispatch equals useDispatch. And then in order to trigger this counter button clicked action, what we have to do is down here in our button, instead of calling setNumberOfClicks, which no longer exists, we simply say dispatch counter button clicked. And that will basically trigger that counter button clicked action in our application. Redux will pick it up. It will call the corresponding reducers, which will change the state. And that's about it. Let's head over to our application now and see if this works. We're going to click on the click button here. And sure enough, we see that our application is still working, except now it's using Redux behind the scenes. So how do we implement this increment by thing now? Well, this actually gets a little bit more tricky because our action that we defined has the amount hard-coded. As it happens, what we can do with Redux actions is we can convert them into functions. We usually call these action creators when they're functions. And basically, we can pass in any payload that we want to be included on the action as an argument. And because of ES6 syntax, we have to wrap these in parentheses now. So now what we can do, now that this is a function, we can pass in the amount from our counter button. So instead of just saying dispatch counter button clicked, we say dispatch counter button clicked and pass the increment by as an argument. All right, so it should work just like we want it to now. Let's refresh our app. Set this to something like, we'll do 7. Click it, and we see that it increments just as we want it to. Now, obviously, this is just a very brief introduction to what Redux is capable of. You could obviously add a lot more actions here and have a lot more reducers that kept track of different parts of the state. One other thing to notice is that in our counter button, we're still using the useState hook to keep track of the increment by state variable. Now, you could move this into Redux, but what I've found is that it's generally much better if you only put things in the Redux store that you really need in many places in your application at once. In other words, this increment by would really just make things like your reducers, your actions file, and so on more complicated. All right, so let's move on to our final state management tool, and that is MobX. So MobX is another state management tool that I would say is just as good as Redux for managing larger application states. So let's see how it works. Now, as with Redux, we're going to start with our application at the point in time right after we created our counter button, just using the useState hook, right? So we've got our counter button, we've got our app, but there's nothing else to complicate adding MobX to our application. So let's start off here by installing the MobX library. And to do that, we're going to say npm install MobX and hit enter. And now that we have it installed, let's see how to add it. So we're just going to run our application here so that we can see the changes as we make them. Now, one of the things that people like about MobX over Redux is that it's got far fewer moving parts, so to speak. That is, where Redux has actions, reducers, selectors, etc., MobX is much more straightforward. To see what I mean by this, let's create a new file here, and we're going to call that counter.js. Now, what this counter thing is going to be is a class that we're going to use to store our state. This is just kind of how MobX likes to do things. It prefers to use more of an object-oriented approach than a functional approach like we did with Redux. So the first thing we're going to do here is import something called makeObservable, something called observable, and something else called action from the MobX package. You'll see how we use these in just a minute. And the next thing we're going to do is create the counter class that's going to store the state of our counter. So let's say export class counter. And this counter class is going to have a member variable called number of clicks, which we're going to set equal to 0. This is going to store the state of the number of clicks for our counter button. The next thing we're going to do here is define a method, and this method we're going to call increment. Maybe you see where this is going. And it'll take an argument called amount, and inside that method we're going to say this.number of clicks plus equals amount. So this increment method then is what our components are going to be able to use to change the value of our number of clicks state. All right, and other than that, the only thing we have to do is add a constructor for our counter, which is going to look like this. We're going to say constructor. And inside this constructor, we're going to call this makeObservable function. We're going to say makeObservable. And we're going to say this, and we'll tell it about the number of clicks member variable, which we're going to say is an observable property. And we're going to say increment, which is an action. So what we're doing inside this makeObservable function here is we're basically telling MobX that, first of all, our number of clicks state should be observable, which means that it will automatically re-render React components. Now, this wouldn't happen if you were to just create a basic class and try and use that as a state, so that's what this makeObservable thing does. And the other thing is this increment method, where we're saying that it's an action. MobX also defines something called actions like Redux does, except actions in the case of MobX mean that we're actually calling a method of our state. So that's all we have to do to set up our counter state. Let's save this. And the next thing we're going to do is go into our app component, import this counter that we just defined. We're going to say import counter from counter. And then before we define our app component, we're going to actually create an instance of this counter class. So what we'll say is const counter equals new counter. All right. And then what we're going to do is pass this counter as a prop to our counter button. So what we'll do is say counter equals counter. And then we're going to go into our counter button class and add that as a prop. We'll say counter. And we can delete this number of clicks state. And instead, we're just going to say counter.number of clicks. Okay? And when we set our number of clicks, what we're going to do instead is simply say counter.increment and pass the increment by state as an argument. All right. Okay, and now in order for this to work, we have to import something else called observer. And this observer thing, which we'll see in a second, is actually imported from a package called MobX React. So just like Redux had both a basic Redux package as well as the React bindings for Redux, MobX also has a MobX package and a MobX package which contains the React bindings. So let's say npm install, and this package is going to be called MobX React. There's also one called MobX React Lite, which contains a much more slimmed down version of that package. Why don't we just install that one? Okay, and now that we've installed that, up at the top of our counter button, let's say import observer from MobX React Lite. All right, and then what we have to do is we have to wrap our component in this observer thing when we define it. And what that will do is it'll make sure that our component re-renders at the right times when the state of this counter changes. So one thing to keep in mind here is that if you forget either this observer thing on the component or this makeObservable thing in the constructor of our state, MobX will look like it's not working, and that can be kind of hard to figure out sometimes. So make sure that you use both like that. All right, so now that we've done that, let's start our app back up and check it. All right, so what we're going to see is that if we click on this button now, we'll see that our application works just like it did before, except obviously now it's got MobX doing the state. One other thing that I want to point out is when we create this new instance of our counter class and pass it to our counter button, that might seem a little strange to you. After all, if this counter state were needed somewhere way down in the component tree, we would basically have props drilling all over again as one component passed it to another, to another, to another. So one thing that you can do with these instances is you can actually use context to make it so that components can access them without having to receive them as props. Now, I'm going to leave that up to you as an exercise, but basically you just need to combine what we learned here with what we learned about context earlier, and have a context that makes this counter instance available to any component that needs it.